right now. Thanks once again to listening to a conversation, this time with Dr. Amy Adler. And she is a clinical research psychologist and senior scientist with the Center for Military Psychiatry and Neuroscience at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. She completed clinical internship and fellowship at medical centers in Chicago. She served as a clinical psychologist in military health clinics in Germany, that's close to Holland, as an instructor with the University of Maryland European Division, and as a research psychologist. I came to know her because of her work with combat stress and the iCOVER drill. And her research interests include developing easily fielded emotion regulation techniques and assessing the role of mindfulness training in military units. She also initiated a series of studies examining behavioral health leadership and iCOVER training, which is now also adapted in the Dutch military, and there are in other countries programs like this. A training for peer-based management of acute stress and high-stake operations. Well, you did a lot of great research, and I really enjoy your research. So thank you for making the time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
I wanted to talk to you about the topics of mental health and combat stress as a general overview. And maybe I can just start with a question related to that, and that is, what is the impact of war on mental health? And to give a little bit context, here in Europe,
you cut out just for a second, but I think you asked, what is the impact of war on mental health?
Correctly.
Is that what you asked?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, nothing like jumping into the deep end. So this is a very big question. I think combat I think war affects communities, people, people who are there to serve, people who are there as victims, so war as a big question is something that maybe we'll just want to narrow down to focus on the piece that my work is mostly about, which is about service members in combat and who are engaging in operational work. As part of that. So I think I want to be clear that not everybody who participates in military operations or combat or war as a service member is necessarily negatively impacted, not necessarily. But generally, we have focused on identifying the negative impact that war can have on individual service members related to sort of the classic diagnoses like post-traumatic stress disorder and behavioral difficulties like alcohol misuse. There are also other kinds of outcomes like problematic anger. I know that although it's not a classic diagnosis that clinicians come across typically, it's embedded as a symptom in some of the outcomes that we look at, but even just on its own, it's uniquely associated with all kinds of negative outcomes. And so I think there are lots of ways in which the negative effects can be experienced, but I do want to point out that there's also positive things that can come with functioning in a combat environment. Individuals can engage in really work that has a huge amount of meaning to them, whether it's, pursuing a belief or a value that they have, whether it's taking care of their battle buddies, their fellow unit members, whether it's serving as a leader, if they're engaging in purposeful work that has meaning to them and that they're able to take care of one another in that context, it can lead them feeling like positive things as well. So it's always a very difficult question to answer because it's both. And I don't want to oversimplify it by saying it's only one. It can also be both, right? It doesn't have to be either or for an individual either. It could be both.
Because you've done a lot of work into the concept of resilience. And for as far as I know, resilience, there is also a part in resilience where you grow from adversity. Yeah.
I think resilience can also just be returning back to baseline. You know,
Yeah.
for some people, they can grow and develop, and there's this concept of post-traumatic growth,
Yeah.
Which I'm sure your viewers will be familiar with. But it's also possible that just maintaining under extreme stress or bouncing back quickly is also a sign of resilience.
Yeah. When we narrow in a little bit to service members, military members, can you just elaborate a little bit about what is combat stress, and maybe more specific, what is the acute stress reaction? So what is combat stress and what is the acute stress reaction?
So combat stress is the experience of being overwhelmed or burdened or experiencing more strain than your resources would normally be able to allow you to react. And the combat stress can be the result of potentially traumatic events, like being in a firefight, or it can be the result of ongoing chronic deployment hassles that somebody might have to endure, lack of privacy, boredom occasionally, just uncertainty, unpredictability. There can be all kinds of sources and stressors. Both are important to consider. And then the stress, of course, is the degree to which somebody feels strained by it, right? Burdened by it. You can think of it like a stress bucket, right? We can all maintain a certain amount of stress in our lives. We need stress in order to cope, but at a certain point, if we don't find a way of kind of coping effectively, the stress bucket can overflow. So that's kind of a simple metaphor that I think a lot of people are probably familiar with. Acute stress reaction is a special case. And if you don't mind, I want to describe how I first started thinking about it.
Great.
Because I've been doing this work for quite a while. And I was at a conference with an officer, a social worker actually, who had been working in the field, not in the US, but he's actually was from the Israel Defense Forces. And he started talking to me about, what do you do when somebody freezes in an immediate way in the middle of a firefight? And I realized, in all the work that I had done and that my colleagues have done and my counterparts in other countries have done, I realized we hadn't been thinking about that moment, right? That moment where it's not just somebody might have post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms or problematic anger or indiscipline, like they engage in behaviors that get themselves in trouble, but that they might actually be so overwhelmed by some specific event that they freeze or stop functioning for a period of time. And it's that experience of freezing or not being functional for a period of time because of some combat-related event that is well described as an acute stress reaction. It's not a disorder, so it's not in our DSM, our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. It's not like a classic disorder. It is in the ICD, but it's described as just sort of a natural consequence of trauma. It's not a disorder per se. So normally, I think clinicians and mental health researchers aren't thinking about it because it doesn't qualify as a disorder. But if you're in that unit and it happens to you or your battle buddy, even if it's not classically a disorder, it's going to impair functioning and it's going to impair performance, the ability of you to look out for yourself, the ability of you to look out for your battle buddy, the potential impact on the unit, the potential impact on the mission. So for units, they actually would care about it. But there was this gap between what we had been researching and the reality that was actually potentially, some units were facing. And as soon as this social worker started to talk to me about it, I stopped him and I said, I'm all in, whatever let's talk. I want to pursue this. He retired out of the IDF. He came and spent a year at my organization, Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And we really worked on taking what he had created, which is called Yahalom, in the IDF, and then adapting it for the US, both culturally and just in terms of optimizing it for implementation in a military that is not just where we don't have conscripts, right? We have people who are volunteers who are highly motivated to learn quickly and adapt whatever new information we have that could help them perform better under stress.
Well, great. It's a great term. We did a literature research when developing when talking about acute stress reaction, because we were a little bit, should we call it freezing, should we call it choking, and so on. And but in sport psychology, you have the concept of choking under pressure. Is that a? Can you compare it a little bit with the acute stress reaction?
I think maybe, but in sports psychology, if people talk about choking under pressure, it means they're not performing at their best.
Yeah.
Right. So if they're, suddenly having, I don't know which sport would be the best sport to
Take
demonstrate, but let's say
yeah.
they have to do, they have, let's say it's football, and they're, they're there and they have to kick the ball into the goal at the, because they get a try at that, and they blow it, they kick it, but it goes to the side. Right. Or so they've choked under pressure, right? Because everybody's watching and the whole game depends, the whole match depends on their ability to kick the ball in the net, and they blow it and they kick it to the side. That's an example of choking under pressure. I think that's different, unless I've misunderstood the sports side of things. I think that's different than what we're talking about, because here we're talking about potentially life-threatening events that are so traumatic that the individual's amygdala, so the part of the brain responsible for the fight or flight reaction, just sort of takes over. It gets into the driver's seat and it pushes the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's thinking, planning, using judgment, able to kind of manage a lot, and it pushes it to the side. And so I think probably just the experience of it is going to be rather different than if you're just choking and by accident you kick the ball to the side. So that would be how I would answer that. I'm curious, what do you think of that?
Yes, I think also that because normally if you miss the penalty, then a second later you just you're frustrated, but you can go on with the game, so to speak. And if I understand you correctly, acute stress reaction, you don't get out it by yourself that easy.
Right. Well, there was an open question. I can talk about that, but also the person's able to function to a limited capacity in the sports analogy. In the military analogy, the functioning interferes with the unit being able to, like, it's like the person stops. So that's slightly different. It would be that the similarity would be if that person at the penalty line can't even kick, and they just stand there and are unable to kick, and that doesn't typically happen. So I think in that way, I think the stakes are slightly different, although for a professional sports person, it might feel similarly critical, but the stakes are a little different. I think what happens at the level of the brain, there might be some parallel, but I think it's probably a little different too. Although I am aware that there's so much we don't know about acute stress reaction. We don't even know precisely what the criteria should be for determining it. We don't have like perfect ways of measuring it. Ideally, we'd be using all kinds of complicated gadgets. In reality, for combat scenarios, that's not practical, and it's not the primary, research is not the primary goal. And so we have to find other ways to assess it.
What in one of the articles I think in the iCOVER protocol, you talk about the different phases of acute stress disorder. How do I recognize that a comrade of mine is in acute stress reaction?
So what's interesting is there are both somatic kind of experiences. If somebody is freezing, there's some somatic components. There are cognitive components. There's, maybe an emotional component of panic. But the underlying consistent way in which somebody can be identified as having some sort of acute stress reaction is that they are no longer functioning. And that's kind of the underlying way to think about it, because there are different pathways that this acute stress reaction could take. So it could be the person kind of gets disorganized, and in the movies, you've probably seen it depicted as the person tears off their gear and runs into the minefield or something because they're kind of overwhelmed by stress and they're not thinking. Or they might just cower in a corner, frozen, or unable to focus, or they might freeze almost like in a catatonic way. So there are different ways in which it might be enacted or depicted or experienced. But what's probably more important at this stage in our understanding, I'm not saying eventually, but at this stage in our understanding, probably what's most important is that in all three cases, the person's not functional anymore. And so for us, we're thinking, who needs to know what's going on? And it's the other unit members. It's not the psychologist who's far away or the physicians who are located somewhere far away from where this is occurring. It's their unit that needs to be able to identify it. So these are behaviors that individuals can see in others. And in fact, we've asked survey questions of soldiers with experience in combat, and about 40 to 50% of them have said, yes, I've seen this in other people. So these are observable. This is an observable event. And I don't think it's as critical for them at this stage to know which variant the person has if the underlying consistency is the person's not functioning and they're overwhelmed by mental stress and it's interfering with their ability to function. So that's kind of how we ask the question. We don't call it an acute stress reaction because people aren't necessarily going to know that phrase, but we do, we ask the soldiers questions that they could relate to.
And how do you call it? Is there a concept which is also understandable? No. I reframe my question. How should we talk about it to service members?
So I would say there are two things. One is when I'm asking questions on a survey and somebody may not have been trained in iCOVER, and I know we'll talk about iCOVER later. I don't want to use fancy terminology. I just want to have them understand what it is I'm saying. So there's no simple term in English to describe it that they'll zero in on and know what I mean. So what we ask is, have you ever, questions like, have you ever seen someone in your unit so stressed by a combat-related event that they stopped functioning for a period of time? So mentally overwhelmed that they stopped functioning. And that's the underlying consistency. I don't put a label on it at that point. But when we go to train iCOVER, which is what do you do about it, that training does include the phrase acute stress reaction. And we did make a decision not to call it a combat stress reaction because that is a phrase we use that's a broader phrase that includes all kinds of responses that also occur after some combat-related event may have occurred, and it might involve indiscipline or withdrawing, or it's a much broader phrase, and it can also happen outside of combat per se. For example, in the middle of a training accident, or in some other horrific thing that might happen. So we didn't want people to also be overly narrow in how they were thinking about the concept.
Oh, that's a great rationale. Yeah, great. Yes. Well, you already talked about the intervention, but I also like to talk about prevention and recovery, but we can start with the intervention. And from what I understand, there are some, you write about the peace, the proximity, intimacy,
So you're talking about PIEs?
Sorry,
PIEs? Okay.
But what is how did you came up with the iCOVER protocol, and what is the relationship with PIEs?
Okay, sure. So first, maybe if it's okay, I'll just mention how frequently an acute stress reaction happens. That might help, because otherwise people might be thinking, how much does this really happen? In fact, in my own group, we realized nobody had ever, as far as we were aware, so it's possible it's out there, but I've not seen it, ever put some estimate of how frequently this occurs for any one individual. So we did a couple of surveys, and we asked soldiers who had been in a combat-related event, were you so mentally stressed during a combat-related event that you were overwhelmed and couldn't function? You were overwhelmed by stress and couldn't function. And what was interesting is we were taking kind of guesses as to how many people would say, yeah, maybe that's me, that could be me. The number was, depending on the denominator we use, the number was between 17 and 23%. So it's a fairly significant number if you're thinking, you've got a small squad or a team, a squad, a platoon of soldiers who are expected to function in some way. And if you get 1 in 6 who are not, who are having this experience, that's a good sign that that this is worth our time, right?
Yeah.
It's worth time thinking about, it's worth time researching, it's worth time, if we can find an intervention, it's worth time providing that intervention, because their time is an essential commodity, and we want to make sure we're not wasting anyone's time. So we also asked soldiers who said that they may have experienced this, how long did it last? Because if their momentary experience of not functioning under this extreme stress is only like a second, I think we can call it good. I don't think we need to pursue it in depth, and I don't think we need a complicated training. And I think we can just, let it be what it is. So when we were first researching this, we asked the question, we got the estimate of how much this was happening, about 1 in 6. And then we asked, so how long did this last? How many, did it last like 5 seconds? And about a quarter of them said, yeah, it was about 5 seconds. But then more than half said it was more than 5 minutes. So if it's more than 5 minutes, if you're in an occupational or in an operational setting and it's more than 5 minutes, that's a meaningful amount of time. And so then from that, we were able to have confidence that, yeah, this is something we need to focus on. We don't know enough about it. I work a lot with within the US military, but also with our counterparts and our allies, and nobody had been researching this question. So it was really an opportunity to show that psychology in various forms can really make a difference, and can ask questions that matter and potentially develop something that can make a difference for units. So from there, we created, based on what the Israelis had done, we created iCOVER. So it's little I, COVER, all capital, and it's an acronym, but it also describes kind of what we're doing, right? I'm covering you, you're covering me if this happens to me. And so it's iCOVER. And it stands for each step of the process and the procedure. Now, you asked, how does this relate to PIES?
Yeah.
And I want to point out that PIES, which is proximity, immediacy, expectancy, and simplicity, those are the principles for how to handle kind of ongoing stressors that somebody may be, or ongoing stress. So remember, I mentioned combat stress reaction is different from what we're calling acute stress reaction, because it's broader. Yeah. It's really what are the principles that would guide you in setting up some sort of almost therapeutic opportunity for people to recover following, some sort of ongoing stressor. So those are the principles used. They come from World War II. They've been demonstrated for many years as kind of the gold standard in care, and you try to not remove the person too far away from the front lines. If you're going to care for them, you want to keep it simple, have them have a chance to recover in terms of sleep, food, physical comfort. Sleep is amazingly important, as I think everybody knows, just in helping somebody recover. And you have the sense that the person will be returning. So you expect that the person's going to return. You don't put them in like a clinic, in a patient gown and call them a patient, right? So that's the concept of PIES. And that's really important for combat operational stress control or combat stress control initiatives that various militaries use. But that's very different from the in the moment experience that we're talking about with an acute stress reaction. So what we wanted to do was make sure that the intervention we came up with was something that one battle buddy, one peer could do to another, right? Yeah. Not something that you do later when you're back at the forward operating base, or you're removed in some way from the extreme event. So we needed something that was easily fielded. That's my, something that's super simple, not too complicated, that people can do to help one another.
Yeah. Okay, so and then the protocol itself, of course, you've written. There is also online. There is even I think it's there is a video online, on YouTube.
Sure.
There is
So
a PDF.
I can describe, yeah, I can
Yeah,
describe a little bit about
yeah,
it. So we've done a few studies. One of the studies, the first studies we did was a randomized trial in a training environment where soldiers were, some soldiers were trained in what to do and some weren't, so squads or platoons, depending on the unit we were working with. And then we had them go through a training scenario, a tough, realistic training scenario, where one of the team members was given kind of a clinical card describing how they needed to react, kind of like
yeah,
a patient card. And and so what they would freeze. And then we watched what did they do? Could they not only tell me that they understood the concepts, but could they enact them? And they could. So and at a very high level, and they did well. So these behaviors that we're talking about are very much within reach
yeah,
of what a soldier can do in a high stress environment. We also that was training, but what about when soldiers were actually deploying? So we did a study with soldiers just before they were deployed to the Middle East, so sort of a high stress period of time. And we gave them the training and we asked them, what do you think of the training? It's sort of, is this worth your time? And we got incredibly high responses. And people thought this, not only was it very relevant and important and easy to understand, but it was well timed. They really thought it was fine to get it now because they recognized the relevance of it, and they increased in their sense of confidence that there were things that they could do to help others, and that if this happened to them, there were things that others could do to help them. They also saw it as a unit issue and not just as a sign that somebody was, having problems, but that this is a unit, the unit's responsibility to take
yeah,
care of its team members. So we've done a bunch of different studies. We can't do kind of the gold standard randomized controlled trial in this context because obviously it's combat and it's war, and that's not appropriate. So what the U.S. military has done is funded a study led out of University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill to see if a variant of iCOVER, of this intervention, might work in the emergency departments, in emergency rooms, in hospitals. So they've just started enrolling individuals in this study. It's only just started. It's going to take us a while to find out whether it's how and whether it's helpful. What I found really striking was, just like the military didn't have something on hand until we developed iCOVER, the emergency departments don't either. And I found that really interesting. So it's possible that there's clear relevance in terms, and it's very simple, and we'll talk about what it is, but there are clear gaps that I think people have just been skipping over this part. And if they have a way of thinking about, what do I do? What is my role as somebody in this setting? What can I do for this individual?
yeah.
Then that can help them and just sort of give them structure so they know what they might be able to say or do to help somebody who might be in need.
Well, because I wanted to ask you the question how relevant this is for law enforcement, because um, in the Netherlands there are some studies going on freezing by Professor Rudolphs from Radboud University, but also from a qualitative study about officers who freeze, and I could immediately see the relevance
Yes, yes.
from this.
There are some great police studies looking at the tunneling experience that people have at those moments. And I do think in that case, it's very similar. It's the narrowing of the visual field. It's the elongation of sense of time.
Yeah.
So even our time estimates, where I said it's more than 5 minutes, that's self-report. I'm aware of the limitations of self-report and the sense that time might be distorted in terms of the way people are perceiving it. But it's a first step. And I think the police, I know I have provided this information to various policing groups also in the States. If they find it useful, I'm happy. I think one of the things that we've tried to do is keep it very user-friendly and really practical, which is why we created a video. The Israelis had created a really good video. It was amazing. And we were able to do something similar. And we just, part of it is, yes, it's 6 steps and, somebody has to learn the steps. But part of it is if you tell it in a story, people, I think, naturally remember stories. I think our brains are kind of built for that. So if it's embedded as part of a story, it'll be stickier, right? Easier to.
Absolutely. So what are the essential steps? And of course, people can look it up, but it's nice to hear it from
yes,
you.
it is on YouTube. So absolutely, people can Google or check on YouTube. Look at iCOVER, iCOVER. The first step is which is for identify. So you want to identify the person in need, and we review how can you tell if somebody needs help or not. And then if the person does, you continue on. And the C stands for connect. And what we mean there is having a moment where you are, you try to give eye contact, talk to them, put your hand on their shoulder, for example. I do want to point out that for us in the military, that would be normal. For other contexts, putting your hand on somebody's shoulder might have a different meaning, or if somebody's just been sexually assaulted or something, it might be different. That's come up in our conversations with other groups, so I wanted to acknowledge that. But for the traditional kind of iCOVER scenario, you want to use all those senses to orient the person to the sound of your voice. So you want to say, hey, get their attention, and then go right into offer commitment. And offer commitment, the O for offer commitment is, I'm here with you. I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone. So it's breaking through that almost sensory distance that the person's experiencing during that moment, and hearing that they're not alone, to break through kind of the larger concept of just how far apart they are from the present moment. And then the V stands for verify facts. Now, I want to clarify that we're not actually interested in the facts. What we're trying to do is ask questions, two questions, 3 questions that are such obvious, easy, simple questions that the person responds almost automatically, kind of like jump starting their brain a little bit. So you're going to ask them questions they already know the answer to. You're not asking them, what's 500 divided by 70 or something. You're not asking complicated questions. You're just asking, who's our commander? Who are you in here with? What unit are you in? All the sort of very simple questions that the person can just give an automatic response to. From there, we do E, which is establish order of events. Now, in this case, again, it's not a test of anything, but it's to orient the person in time. It's almost a form of psychological grounding. But by establishing order of events in a super simple way, we say what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen. So it's something like, we took incoming fire, we're treating Sergeant so-and-so who was wounded, and we have to return fire or cover, or evacuate or whatever it is. So very, very simple statement before, during, and after. And then the final step is request action. So you give the person a request that sort of breaks through a sense of helplessness or passivity and gives them meaningful, purposeful action in which they should engage. So for example, in the video, it's cover that window. It might be something, it might be grab this thing and move it over here. It's whatever it is, it's something simple and doable. And that gets them kind of going again. And we don't know if this is the only way to do this, but this is what it fits a lot of what is known about psychology and what's happening at the level of the brain. And the stories we're getting from the front lines are very, very positive. So I think that's very gratifying to know.
Yeah, great. Well, then after well, a lot of questions, but maybe there is a question before that is from research in the Dutch police. The researchers found that freezing has a stigma. Is stigma an English word? Stigma?
Stigma.
Yeah, stigma. So when a police officer froze during an action, and he or she reports that, it backfires a little bit. That's a possibility, yeah? So how in training and in real life are we taking care that it, well, that it is a normal reaction to a not normal situation or something like that?
I think that's really, really important. It's funny, it's not that we don't have stigma related to certain things, but our messaging on this is very consistent, which is this is understandable. You can't predict who it's going to happen to. It's happening at the level of the brain. We call it the amygdala hijack. And I think if you can couch it in language that implies this is happening, it's physiological, it's neurobiological. It's not happening because somebody just isn't motivated, right? It's just happening. It's like a little short circuit that's a natural part of the way the brain reacts. It's why it's not a disorder, right? It's just a natural reaction. We communicate that in our training, and it's also in the video. And what we found is that soldiers are much more likely to say that this kind of reaction is understandable after they experience the training, and that their concerns that they might be treated differently decrease after training, because they realize this is a unit issue and we all need to be ready to help each other. And I think if it's described in that way, it might help address the question of stigma that you're noticing in the police force. But I think the message that this can happen, and it may not be the tough guy, it could be the tough guy in the unit, it could be the person who's the newbie, like the new person. We don't know who it's going to happen. We're not good at figuring that part out yet. We have not done research to know who, or to predict who.
And that's also why I love the term acute stress reaction, because when we're naming it freezing, it has that, like a little,
like a failure.
And on the other hand, that was one of the reasons we came up with choking, because for athletes, of course, it's not nice to joke, but every athlete knows that
everyone does it. Yeah,
everyone does it, and it's a kind of normal, and like well, but then after the action, when everything is said and done, we come to another concept that is, let me just call it for now, the psychological debriefing. And years ago, I tried to research this, and then there was a tradition of critique about critical incident debriefing, that it only made it worse. And now on the other hand, I saw a very great paper. You were the co-author of it, and it was, let me just put my glasses on, The Combat Path, Sustaining Mental Readiness in Ukrainian Soldiers. And it was actually about debriefing after, if I'm correct, debriefing after intense incidents. So can we also talk about that?
Sure.
Yeah.
So
what is this? What is the state of the art?
I want to acknowledge a couple of things, because debriefing is a very hot topic, or used to be a very hot topic, and it was debated a lot. And
exactly.
I think the fair way to describe it is individuals who are victims of some catastrophe, who are not there in their role of, to engage in some potentially traumatic event, but they're just purely victims. The research seems to suggest that debriefing is not necessarily appropriate for them. So the Cochrane review really summarized motor vehicle accident victims, victims of burn injuries, things like that. Probably it's not appropriate for them, and it may even be, the fancy term is iatrogenic, may even be harmful. Right? What is a different question for the military is if you are in a unit that's been pre-briefed, right? But prior to a mission, pre-briefed, and you're there to engage in some activity where you know that there is potential for traumatic stress to occur, but that's actually your job, right? Like with the police, you're the group running in to the problem, not away. You're not there as a victim, right? You're there to do your job, to engage in purposeful action, and you're there as part of a team. For that group, the research seems to suggest that debriefing may play a role, an important, helpful role. This subtlety of distinguishing between individual victims and people in high-risk occupations who have been pre-briefed is a really important distinction to make. But sometimes people think, oh, that's too complicated a distinction to make. Let's just say debriefing is bad.
Yeah.
But if you actually dig into the literature, there is this distinction. And I think it's why, although people had said debriefing shouldn't be pursued, it's stuck around because occupations like firefighting, policing, and the military, they see the relevance of it to their own culture. Yeah. It's a natural part of the after action review process. It's a natural part of supporting one another. It's a natural part of identifying lessons learned and sharing of experiences. So I think that that's why culturally it's such a good fit, but it also might kind of differ from what you'll see in some descriptions around debriefing. So I want to be fair in this. My group and I have done some studies with the military. We even did a randomized trial where debriefing was one of our intervention arms, and that's published. And it showed a benefit for service members, particularly those who had been exposed to higher levels of combat. So I think that there is a role for it. And I've been working with the authorship team that you just described. This is a publication that came out this year. It's called Combat Path Debriefing, and it's with an officer in the Ukrainian military who had been researching the debriefing literature and understanding what was going on, especially in the US, in terms of what leader-led debriefing might look like and after actions reviews might look like. And he came up with his own version of it that made sense in his cultural context, that hit on their particular concerns and concepts that matter culturally to Ukrainians. It's not a randomized trial, right? There's no empirical data about it, but it's enough of a development and an attempt to systematize an approach for Ukraine that it was worth putting together as a manuscript and publishing it. It was published in Parameters, which is a journal of the U.S. Army War College. I'm the senior author on it. And it sort of describes that, even all these years later, after the debate, it's still there and present and still serving a role. And I think in his case, what he came up with is very similar to something we ended up doing in the US, which is rather than being kind of classic CISD, so critical incident stress debriefing that you might have heard about, it's time-driven debriefing. And the reason I call it time-driven is because it's not just in response to one event. Now, this is a real difference in the way that classic CISD is talked about. In the case where I described the research that showed a negative effect, it's a one-off event and it's a one-off intervention. Yeah. In the case that we're talking about, it's embedded in a series of potentially traumatic events. It's not like you do one event and you're done. You're in the military or you're a police officer. You've got a series of these things. And also it's embedded in a healthcare system. So with other resources. So it's not a one time and you're done, it's embedded. And in the case of the Ukrainian example, I think it shows that these units that are coming off of the front lines are not coming off of the front lines and redeploying home and they're done with combat. They're coming off front lines for brief periods of time and then going right back. Yeah. So what kind of relief valve can you provide or apply to enable the person and the team to adjust and then regroup and then go back out? And for them, this is an existential threat. And so they have to find some way to get their folks ready to go back out. And I think what Oleg Hukovsky, who's the first author, came up with was a solution that was culturally specific and had real parallels in what's going on in earlier research that we had completed.
I was particularly impressed by the
talking about their culture, their military identity, the warrior identity, the importance of a narrative, and but if we make it much smaller, because I have worked as a trainer within police. We did scenarios. Now I'm working with emergency medicine. We do scenarios. And still, after having researched all these things, I'm still not confident enough after they have done a high intense scenario, even with a lot of emotions. I'm still not sure. Can I ask at their emotions, and how far can I ask? And because in the police, for example, we had a system where we first asked them, how do you feel? Because there was the logic that their emotions have to get out to come to the ratio, but you can also say the opposite. Just bring them back right to their prefrontal cortex and let the emotions not, how do you call it? What are your thoughts about this? So doing a highly emotional, intense simulation training, do the debriefing of the training. Can we touch upon their emotions?
So this is a very interesting question.
Yeah.
I think for most of the research that's out there, it's not about training scenarios, it's about the real thing. And I do want to point out that in both the US version of debriefing that we've developed and in the Ukrainian version, there's no specific question about how are you feeling and what are your emotions. That's not actually built in to this system. So I just want to acknowledge that. If people want to talk about their emotions, they can, but instead what's baked in is the recognition that it can impact your sleep, your level of anger, it can impact other things. And so we just acknowledge that, not that the person has to talk about it. They don't have to, right?
Yeah.
But we acknowledge it. And then in the case of combat path debriefing in Ukraine, one of the other pieces that's brought in is the acknowledgement of the losses that have occurred, a very specific honoring of the losses. And I think that that's a really important advancement that's been added to what we have done in the past. And I think in that case, it's also very specific to their experience. I think in this case, you don't have to necessarily ask about emotions. And if it's a training scenario, I think you can normalize without them even knowing it, without them even talking about it. You can say, you know, some people feel this or this or this, all of this is normal, and you can offer them that without them necessarily having to feel like you're probing for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's more that as a psychologist in the traditions I have grown up in the psychology traditions, there is a lot of emphasis about that expressing your emotions is very important for mental health, and how you can express them in words, you can express them in writing, you can express them in a lot of ways. So that's more the thing. I have the intuition that it's good to.
I think there is a role for that. I think what I just want to maybe just make a distinction between finding an individually appropriate way to manage one's emotions, whether that's likely through, you know, journaling or through self-reflection or through sharing with somebody close to them. There are ways to make that work, but baking that into some sort of formal event where it's expected or required, I think it's very different. So I just want to acknowledge that. I think the role of debriefing is really focused on the units, of acknowledging what the unit has gone through and validating what their experience is. That's kind of the higher level issue that I guess is being dealt with. I think that's probably why you're not comfortable with it, because you're thinking, I feel like I'm forcing these people to go in a direction that they don't necessarily want to go, or I might be enforcing them to dig in to something that maybe they're better off not digging into. So acknowledging it, saying this is common, these kinds of emotions are common, and then asking them to come up with their own plan for what, you know, some people are going to exercise, some people are going to journal, some people are going to chat about it, you know, with a friend. I think there are ways that people can find, you know, their own individual approach. And, you know, the topic of being flexible, right, becomes
Yeah.
really important with people. I think one of the things that's difficult in a combat environment is that coping strategies that work at home may not necessarily work in a combat environment. So that's where, for the kinds of things we think about, you know, we have to think about, okay, if somebody normally would be listening to music or going on a long walk or talking to someone close to them in their family, maybe that's not an option for them. So
Yeah.
they have to be cognitively flexible. And that's very hard,
Yeah.
right? The strategies may no longer be
Yeah.
available to them.
Yeah.
Depending on what's happened, they may not want to share details around some particularly horrific event with somebody close to them. So that's something to think through
Yeah.
as well.
What I learned from all this research and also from the Ukrainian example, it's so culturally and situation specific. There, I mean, yeah, even the
I think
words you.
yes and no. I
Okay.
think we can take both lessons from the Ukrainian example, right?
Yeah.
The fact that how they're developing their combat path debriefing is infused with culturally specific references,
Yeah.
right? The Cossacks play a role in this. There's a lot of culturally specific concepts in there, but the need for it, the recognition of stress in this environment, the importance of purpose and acknowledgement, validation, leadership, social support, all of that's the same.
Yeah.
So I think there's both, right?
Yeah. Talking about interventions, and now I mean, let's say long-term intervention. There's not necessarily during deployment. For long-term interventions, you wrote a chapter and you talked about the importance of sleep and about social cohesion and so on. But another topic you write about is mindfulness and yoga, so the body-mind disciplines. Why now they are not necessarily accepted traditionally by tough groups. When I was a SWAT instructor, I called all my breathing exercises tactical this, tactical that, because if I talked about yoga, of course, it was. But I think nowadays something has changed. Behind me is also the great book by Amishi. Yeah, a Peak Mind, incredible book. You together wrote also some papers I saw. What is the place of mindfulness and yoga in the long-term mental and physical health for service members? What are your thoughts about it?
I think we're at a particularly fascinating point in history, because I think we're sort of at an inflection point where we are seeing this big shift from organizations that used to dismiss these kinds of concepts to organizations now really turning to unique ways of addressing the stressors and the demands on them, taking advantage of all traditions, all practices, and not necessarily just dismissing it out of hand as being too strange or, you know, inconsistent with what they're used to. In the case of mindfulness, obviously, and yoga, these are ancient traditions. And in the ways that sometimes they're depicted in film, they can seem like a mismatch for an organization like the military or a high-risk occupation like policing or firefighting or emergency services. But I do think that there is a shift. So in the US, for example, we've started, there's a great deal of interest and research in this area. And it's really in large part been led by Dr. Amishi Jha, who's at University of Miami, and she wrote the book that's behind you.
Yeah.
And she's a neuroscientist who studies attention. So she's a hard-nosed empiricist who's interested in demonstrating what's the impact of mindfulness training on the attentional system. And her outcomes aren't self-report. I mean, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I really care about how people feel.
Yeah.
But her outcomes are actual measures of attention and working memory. And so these are not just that they happen to feel good on one particular day. These are actual computer-based assessments of cognitive functioning. And she's been able to show that engaging in mindfulness practice is associated with better outcomes over time. And so I think that because we're able to demonstrate the positive impact, there's interest on the part of senior leaders to turn towards potential solutions that have been ignored in the past. And I also think what's fascinating is typically soldiers coming into the military today, about half of them have been exposed to some form of mindfulness in their schooling prior to coming to the military. So in elementary school or high school, there is now, it's much more typical for mindfulness to be integrated into the classroom activities. So it's more common and familiar to them. Maybe the approach might be slightly different, the focus might be different, but the concepts are there. And if we want to support cultural change, it's got to come sort of from all ends, from the senior leaders, from the trainers, from the junior people coming in. It's got to be encouraged at various points developmentally. There's lots of opportunity. And I think yoga also is a tremendous possible avenue. And I think because that's associated with physical fitness, with strength and balance and flexibility, that there's a chance for it to be well accepted as well as it gets integrated into physical fitness training. And I do think there's interest in that as well. We have done studies that show that it helps service members, both in terms of their mental health and in terms of their physical health as well.
Yeah. And how did you have any thoughts about how to translate this into training programs? I mean,
so how do you scale it, right? This becomes one of our big issues. We're constantly thinking about how can it be scalable? Because in both cases, but I'll just take mindfulness as an example, you can't just train someone in mindfulness and then call it good and say, okay, I'm done. They took the course, so now we're done. Because the benefit comes from the practice and the ongoing nature of the practice. One of the things that Amishi Jha has contributed to the literature that I think is really valuable is trying to quantify how much training do you need in order to see a difference. And so rather than the classic traditional approaches of 45 minutes a day, which just doesn't seem sustainable or possible, she's able to demonstrate it, about 12 to 15 minutes of practice about 3 to 4 times a week seems roughly the minimum that you'd need to make it worth your time. So how do you make that scalable? I think, and how do you make it, I don't know if you have this in the Netherlands, but we have so much training or requirements that sometimes it can become just one more program. One more thing to do, one more demand, one more requirement. And rather than kind of go down that path, I think it's really important to develop a scalable solution that will fit with the culture, that's supported by leaders, that makes sense to individual soldiers, and that's doable. We're still figuring that out. We have plans to test out scalable solutions. And so hopefully that'll be happening in the next year or two. We're also looking at potentially having an app that's oriented around attention and performance. Most of the mindfulness apps are not oriented around that. And so there's taking the lessons learned from Peak Mind and the research that's been done in the military and figuring out how to integrate it. So Amishi is also working in that area as well. So it's great to see that. Hopefully in the next year, we'll be able to describe the benefits and the ways to optimize it.
And you did some studies. Here is one study: impact of mindfulness training and yoga on injury and pain-related impairment, a group randomized trial in basic combat training. So am I correct that your research points out that mindfulness training and yoga has positive impacts?
Yes. So it was very exciting for us to see this. In this case, it's not just self-report, although we do have self-reported benefits of mindfulness and yoga associated with the degree to which pain interferes with training or functioning, sleep, stress levels, things like that. But also that in terms of whether somebody's injury has been registered in the system and whether they've gone to seek medical care. So using other forms of data, not just self-report, we're able to show that it slows down the person and it decreases the likelihood the person will have gone to seek medical care for an injury. And, you know, I think you're probably familiar that if somebody isn't injured, if somebody is injured, they're more likely to be injured in the future, right? So there are potential long-term ramifications of this as well. And unfortunately, this study did not distinguish between mindfulness and yoga, but I don't know that it's really unfortunate. It wasn't, we had to do the study quickly. We only had a certain amount of time and available number of units, and to be powered correctly, so it's a statistical term, to run a study to see a difference. We decided to do a gold standard combined approach because these are complementary approaches, yoga and mindfulness, they're complementary, versus training as usual. And that's how we ran the study. But we can't say it was this component that caused the positive effect or that component that caused the positive effect. They're complementary, and we believe that they both work together. But of course, I would love to dismantle it and figure out how do you optimize, what's the most efficient way to do it.
Yeah. Well, we have talked about acute stress reaction in the intervention, iCOVER intervention. This is also about long-term mental health, but there is also the concept of mental skills training. Well, how like in performance psychology, yeah, like self-talk and imagination and so on. Did you have any studies done on that, or how is this in your total package, so to speak?
Sure. So in fact, there was a large group randomized trial looking at mental skills training at basic combat training. And it did use the classic sports psychology approaches of deliberate breathing and self-talk and goal setting and attention control and things like what's important now, right? Focusing attention. So energy management, different skills around those topics, which I'm sure will be familiar to sports psychologists. And it was teaching soldiers going through basic combat training versus, in this case, it wasn't training as usual. We actually needed to give them an equivalent neutral opportunity to learn stuff in which they weren't under high pressure, right? So our comparison condition was learning about military history and why they were doing certain things in basic combat training that they were being asked to do. So learning the historical reasons for it. So kind of a purpose-oriented thing in a way. So we randomized platoons into these two groups, and then we followed them up in terms of their performance on military tasks and in terms of self-report as well. And what's really interesting is nobody had ever done this kind of large scale. I think there were more than 1,600 participants in the study. No one had ever done such a large scale sports psychology study that I'm aware of before. And it was sort of putting it all on the line because a lot of the published work had been on, you know, athletes who were elite in their sport. And you can't do a big randomized trial if you're, you know, have Olympic athletes as your subject population. So we had this opportunity, and we worked with really tremendous sports psychologists who are just really amazing in thinking about how do you take these concepts and apply them in such a way that soldiers will understand. And we had it not done as one day of training, but little bits of training integrated throughout the first weeks of basic combat training. So 20 minutes at a time. And we used what in the military is called hurry up and wait time. I don't know if that expression means anything, but you know, in large organizations, there's no time to do anything, but everybody has to stand and wait for the bus or the food to be delivered or the equipment to be free. And it was during those periods of times that we popped our training opportunities into the schedule. And we looked, and over time, the people who had been in the intervention condition with the mental skills actually did better on certain military tasks and in certain like obstacle course activities. For example, they grouped their shots more successfully the first time around. You have to, when people are doing marksmanship, they have to group their shots, and they were able to do that much more successfully than the people in the military history condition. They had to do various, like they had to walk along a beam that was very high up. There was a net underneath, but it was an elevated beam, and step over a big step and then walk to the end. And we videotaped it, and then we timed it. And people were blind to which condition, masked in terms of which condition the individual was in. And we found that they did it 7 seconds faster.
Yeah.
So we were able to demonstrate that there are very practical benefits associated with performance and the use of mental skills if they are trained in mental skills.
Yeah.
So that is now sort of more commonly done in the military, that the mental skills are now infused throughout, both in training and in operational units as well. And I think that was really exciting. It was one of the first times that we were able to demonstrate empirically, using really kind of gold standard scientific approaches,
Yeah.
Not a quasi-experimental design, but a really full-fledged group randomized design with the right statistics, that we were able to demonstrate this kind of effect.
Is it possible to do scientific studies on the effects of a certain mental skill, or maybe a group of mental skills in combat? Is such a study possible?
I'm not sure. I don't know. We haven't done that as far as I'm tracking. We have done studies where we've trained people in these skills before they deployed. But in terms of doing a randomized trial, that is not something we've done, because that would really mean we already know this stuff is helpful in a training context. We probably wouldn't want to be withholding that from one group. So, and that's why we picked the training context, because the stakes aren't quite as high. So yeah, I think this is where doing this kind of research in an organization where the stakes are life and death, we have to really be thoughtful. And I know it's the same thing for policing and emergency response responders. You have to be really thoughtful about where you are going to put your efforts in terms of the gathering data. And not that the data from combat isn't relevant, but it's going to be it might be qualitative, or after they get back.
Exactly. Yeah. I would love to ask you 2 questions before I let you go. And maybe these are the most difficult questions, but they are nice questions. The first question is, what kind of research would you love to do? If there is one kind of research project, what is the research project you would love to do in the future?
Well, I can describe what I'm currently interested in pursuing. It may not be, it's not a wild and crazy idea. It's something very practical. I think most of my work is pretty practical. I've been working on, with the team at WRAIR, at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, we've been working on creating very short little videos. They're actually like animated cartoons teaching emotion regulation strategies. So helping people kind of think of new ways of approaching when they get like overwhelmed by emotion. How can they manage it very quickly and effectively so that they can respond in a way that they want to respond? And we've been creating these little videos, and I want to assess the utility of these little videos. And we have pilot data that shows that it's valuable, but it's basically the concept that I've been really fascinated by is generally we've been taking traditional approaches to training, PowerPoint slides, maybe a little video here and there, but it's kind of resource intensive, time intensive, people intensive. But what do people naturally move towards? They naturally move towards stories, and they naturally move towards their phones, right? Like I can scroll through and look at reels or shorts or whatever they're called, these little short videos. Can we infuse psychology in this kind of structure and make a difference for soldiers? So we're meeting them where they're at, rather than making them adapt to us. And I have been thinking a lot around that, and that is probably sort of, maybe it's not the most creative, far-fetched answer, but it's the one
beautiful.
that I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah, we also, I personally also, yes, exactly the same reason. Then the last question, what is the best book people should read about everything we talked about now? And of course, Amishi's Peak Mind book is one, but we already talked about that. What is a great inspiration? It can also be a movie or a podcast, of course.
That's really hard. I don't know that I have a simple answer for that. I don't know that I have one book that would sort of answer all questions.
Okay, not
but
maybe.
I do think what I try to do is go back and forth between sort of the scientific information that's available, kind of the people who are providing top of the line scientific research, empirical evidence describing it, and people's experiences, and always remembering to go back and forth between the two, because that's where you can kind of come up with new ideas and new ways of thinking about things that can help service members or people in the emergency services. I think it's just remembering to listen to both voices, but it's not just that one person's one anecdote is what should drive the story. You have to go back to, well, but what does the science say? What do we know for sure? And it's going back and forth.
So are you actually saying read some literature, some
Well, I'm a science geek, so yeah.
Non-fiction and fiction. The best of both worlds.
I think there are many voices and they all matter.
Yeah.
You have to look for the commonality and the threads and the points of inspiration.
Well, Dr. Adler, thank you so much for your time, inspiration, with all your work you published, and it's really great. It's broad, it's practical, it's scientific. Well, it's everything you ended with. So, did I forget to ask you something?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to come and chat with you. I also, what I've been talking about, it's all a team effort. I guess I need to just really make sure that's clear. I've been working with just tremendous research partners over the years, and people with applied experience who inform every step of our work. And I just want to acknowledge that that's, everything's it's a team sport. Science is a team sport.
Well, again, thank you so much. And also thank you all service members, police officers, firefighters, military, emergency medicine. But we can go on and on. Also school teachers, everybody who's in the front line of a society. Thank you for your service. And thank you, Dr. Adler. And I will end this session and say goodbye after this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening, and till the next time.